Trey Lance trade was the key component in the Dolphins landing Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, and Bradley Chubb in an 18-month span. Here's the breakdown from Breer. The Dolphins packaged the first rounder they got from Lance in 21 for Jalen Waddle. In 22, that first rounder went for Tyreek Hill. And in 23, that first rounder was part of the Bradley Chubb deal. I'll add one more thing to that. The 21 pick that they used to move up for Waddle, they traded the 12th pick, which was
Micah Parsons?
Yes, correct. So superstars attached to that trade.
Yeah. I listen. No one's saying that we know all the information to this, but here's what we know for a fact. Like this is not arguable. It's a 100% fact. Even if they did not have a quarterback, that Trey Lance would not get traded straight up for any of those three players. They would not. Jalen Waddle is, have you watched that guy? Holy shit, he's good. Tyreek looks exactly like Tyreek's looked. And Bradley Chubb just, went for a late first round pick. And I wouldn't say he's a star pass rusher, but the Broncos would not have made the trade even if they didn't have a quarterback straight up for Trey Lance, right? They wouldn't have made that trade. So that deal had to be made because they were going quarterback hunting. But given what that netted, specifically the Dolphins, is pretty fucking nuts. I mean, they're two best players on offense by a mile. I mean, Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are two of the better offensive players in the NFL. And then it nets them by far the best pass rusher who was available. Now they got to pay Bradley Chubb. But my point is that you don't typically see. Remember when Daryl Morey's conference gave the Raiders like some incredible grade, the trade of the year for trading Khalil Mack?
I think it was trade of the year.
Well, yeah, in theory, when you use your picks to get good players, but I think they use some of those picks on dudes that are in jail and guys that are no longer on their team. Like that trade was a disaster. And you'd be like, well, the Bears didn't win the Super Bowl. Well, they went to the playoffs twice with Khalil, and then they flipped him for a second-round pick. So it's like his value maintained.
Getting the picks is only half of the trade.
Yeah, these guys utilize their picks. They really only used one of them, right? They used it to get Jalen Waddle, and that has netted them.
And they used the third-round pick on a Georgia linebacker.
All these trades included more, but this was the key component. Like they could not have got Tyreek Hill if they did not have the second first-round pick, right? Like they're not getting Tyreek Hill without that pick. They're not getting Bradley Chubb today without that pick. So I would say that is as good. They did this in 18 months. This wasn't like, well, over a 4-year span. I mean, Trey Lance draft happened, guy, in late April of 2021. We're in November of 2022. Wouldn't you say that's a relatively short span to acquire all this talent?
It really a great argument when you trade away picks, high picks, right? Like really high picks like that. In that situation, that you should then turn around and use those picks. You really increase your chances of getting good players if you don't use those picks in the draft, right?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to say.
Because what was the other big trade they did a few years ago? And the picks actually didn't really. They used the picks on picks, and it didn't really pay out.
Laramie Tunsil.
Yeah, the Tunsil deal, right? And they ended up with the offensive lineman out of SC. Who's the other?
I think didn't they take a pass rusher from UCLA that transferred to Miami?
Oh yeah, that's right. Jalen.
Here's the thing, like part of the Trey Lance trade is you're getting a quarterback on a rookie contract. Well, they have nothing to show for 2 years, so now Trey Lance to even have a chance to have this not be one of the great teeter-totter trades of all time has 2 years to prove his worth. That's what he has, guy. 2 years. And honestly, 1 year to prove he's worth a fifth-year option. Like the clock on Trey Lance, because he redshirted and then he got injured, is going to be moving like 90 miles an hour down the train tracks next year, right? Like your time to figure this out is not you have a contract. Like you're not picking up a fifth-year option if he's bad next year or even average. You don't do that with a quarterback. It takes too much of your salary cap. So this is. The Miami Dolphins, as we sit here today, are winning that trade in a fucking landslide. And the pressure on Trey regardless of this trade, was already be enormous. However this plays out, but I think you always get when you're part of a big trade, it stays with you for a while. And the Dolphins are good now. And listen, I've watched a decent amount of Dolphin football. I mean, a major reason they're good is because those two fucking receivers. I mean, Tyreek has added an element to their team that has taken them to another level.
Yeah. The irony is, I don't know if the Niners would be much better if they had those three guys. Like the Niners, I mean, don't get me wrong, Tyreek Hill makes you better. But the Niners' problem is not offensive skill position guys. The Niners' problem is quarterback on offense and a lack of the ability. I know Jimmy just played a phenomenal game, and we've talked a lot of words about Jimmy Garoppolo. But what doesn't change is if you think you're getting what they thought or think, I don't know what they think right now, they're getting in Trey Lance or what they were getting in Trey Lance, you do that deal again, right? You do that deal for what you think. You do that deal to try and get a franchise quarterback. And if you think you're getting a franchise quarterback, you do that deal every time.
But I think the flaw in their logic is when they made the deal, that it turned out there was a lot of unknown.
Yeah, they might have turned out to pick the wrong guy, but I'm just saying you do that deal if you think you're drafting a franchise quarterback.
But my point is like they were picking based on three guys. You know, they thought they were all three talented. It turned out like the other guy that they might have picked would have even been a bigger royal disaster because his ceiling just doesn't even exist. Like the only holdout hope at this point in time with Trey Lance is he has a high physical ceiling. Because we've seen the floor, it's been a rocky road, right? His own coach does not believe he can complete passes consistently.
Yeah, I mean, he's played. I'm not here to defend. I'm not defending him because we've done a lot of criticizing. But I mean, he's barely played any football, right?
Tyreek Hill has 69 catches for the Miami Dolphins.
Oh, I mean, he's incredible. Yeah.
Jalen Waddle has 5 touchdowns. They two have combined through 8 games for 111 catches and 7 touchdowns. The two of them. My point is not that they needed these two specific guys. They gave up 3 picks that just like we'll get into the Rams probably a little bit later. Like the reason they couldn't get Christian McCaffrey, they couldn't trade for Brian. They're out of capital because they've used it all. Like the Niners used capital, right? If you told me this year the Niners had a first-round pick, Bradley Chubb might be on their team, right? Or they might have made some big, huge acquisition. They might have traded for Brian Burns. They might have made – they don't have any capital either because they don't have a first-round pick. Like when you use capital, there is a price. Howie Roseman said this a while ago, and I think David Tepper copied him. Every single team in the league has the same amount of capital to spend on players and the same amount of draft picks to use on players. You just get to pick and choose how you want to use it. And when you do this, like I'm with you, the logic of it's fine, but we're going to go on 2 years and they got nothing to show for it. You could say, well, you redshirted and then he got injured. Some of it's, yeah. The fact or the fact, like this is a result-oriented business. And the results right now, based on that trade, is a fucking disaster.
Yeah, but my point is if that trade came to you again this year and you thought you had your franchise quarterback, you would do that trade again.
But this is where I think you look at previous drafts now, and it just shows you, like, I'm not as confident these quarterbacks. Like,
I agree.
I'm less confident. Like, I think Mahomes and Josh Allen are such outliers that they've skewed everyone's views of, like, I think Goff and Wentz now are closer to they're better players, obviously, but like I view them much closer to like the Rosens and the Randos that end up sucking because they are these teams like the Lions do not want Jared Goff, right? They're just stuck with them. They're just utilized, and especially they're paying them that much.
They don't have better options.
No, so you don't want to use a high pick on quarterbacks when the guy is not going to be a top 12-ish quarterback. Because you're just spinning your wheels.
I agree with you. That's why I'm not saying Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes' name. I'm just saying what happens every time. The same way that athletics directors end up paying $15 and $30 million buyouts for college football coaches, and yet they replace them with coaches that cost $8 million a year, is the next time you think this is the time because I have to keep taking these shots in order to get my guy, right? Because you're just saying, because if I told you the Niners had a guy that right now you thought was a top 12 guy, we wouldn't. It'd be a win-win trade, right?
Oh, for sure. Well, that's the only way the Niners this trade isn't an utter disaster for them if he doesn't turn into a top 12-ish player.
Well, if he turns into a top 12 guy, it's a win for them. It's not only not an utter disaster, it's a win, right? You give up 3 first-round picks knowing those could be 3 really good players.
100%. I'm saying it's a win-win, but anything other than that, it's already a win for the Dolphins. It is a L for the 49ers. And right now, through 2 years, it is a L for the 49ers. Is that debatable, really? Through 2 years, based on the information we have on Trey Lance, that trade is a disaster.
No, but it's an L. But I guess my point is it's an L if the Dolphins have used those 3 picks on guys that suck, right? It turned out. Because the opportunity cost is the same. Like you said, you can choose to use that in the draft, or you can choose to use that on Tyreek Hill, right? That's the irony, is that the Bears, the award that the Raiders got, it almost looks worse for the Raiders in the sense that everyone said, like, this value is incredible, congratulations, and they squandered the whole thing. It didn't change what the Bears gave up. Right. The Bears might have done something completely different. Like the Bears might be worse off. They might have done something completely different with all those picks.
100%. The problem specifically for the Niners is the clock. Like their time crunch on this contract.
No, it's true.
Because, like, for example, would you imagine that after this season that the Green Bay Packers pick up the 5th-year option on Jordan Love?
No.
100% no. And I just think, like, he has, assuming he's the starter, which I don't think you can just confidently assume based on sitting here on November 1st, right? A lot of stuff to play out. If they could get a redo, I think they would have a redo. And anytime, like, that's not hindsight. Of course, they didn't know that when they made the move. My point is, sitting here today, we have information, right? There was a stock that I own that I'm like, I kind of want to buy another stock. I should sell that. This was like 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, well, I'll just wait a couple weeks. The market's been a lot more comfortable. It's gone down about 10K since. And now I'm at the point where it's like, well, I'll just throw a little more money, buy it cheaper, and just ride it out. But it's like, I didn't know 2 weeks later that it would be down. So I can't get mad at myself for 2 weeks. But my gut at the time said, more, if on the pie chart was like 80, you should probably do it. But it was like, it was just kind of fucking around. It didn't necessarily matter. When you make that trade, and part of making the trade up to a non-pick where you control your destiny, because you don't control your destiny at 3, and then it turns out the way they described it, like, I do think it's fair to say, pretty flawed logic, their approach, and it turns out one of the guys they were clearly really high on, which everyone knew, and this is why, like, sometimes the public is just right, would have been, like, if Kyle potentially would have gotten his way, or who knows how it exactly played out, would have been one of the worst picks in the history of the league. Right, if they would have taken Mac Jones.
Yeah. But they didn't. Just like they didn't not trade for Trey Lance, right? They also
But I think it speaks to the logic, like, it was between the two guys, and they're just they were betting on this other guy that they could coach up and figure out, which it turned out to be kind of a flawed premise too, because, like, why doesn't Jonathan Kuminga get more minutes? Because the Warriors are trying to win titles. Right? It's just they don't get to be the Orlando Magic. Why can't Trey Lance just figure it out and lose? Because they're not into losing games. Like, it ain't going to be cool. And what's going to change next year? Right? It's not like they're just going to be like, cool with him, just figure it out on the fly. Like, it's going to be the same fucking thing. It's going to be the same thing. Now, maybe mentally he's taken another step because he's got to sit back, but there's going to be no, like, yeah, we'll just let him figure it out. It's just not going to fly.
Well, they may not have a choice though next year, right? Somebody might pay Jimmy Garoppolo more money than they're able to pay him. So what do? Well, the Vikings aren't trading them Kirk Cousins, right? I mean, they may not. They, like, this year they lucked into a choice because Jimmy was getting surgery. A choice that wouldn't have been there for them.
But isn't it clear they would 100% sign some veteran quarterback, whether it be a Nick Foles, a Matt Ryan?
Yeah,
not, like they
those
would.
Guys might not, like, Trey might be better than those, like, might give them a better chance to win than those guys do, right?
100%. But my point is they won't roll into the season with just like Trey Lance and Brock Purdy, right?
I doubt it. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that Trey isn't going to be their starting quarterback. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't give them a better chance to win than those other guys. Now, I do agree. If they could do it over, they would just go, hey, it turns out we're just winning games with Jimmy. Jimmy Garoppolo would just be their quarterback right now. Again, right?
Yeah. And you just sign, a Nick Foles like backup was what they would do, right? They would just have insurance for Jimmy Garoppolo and use those picks if they could redo it. This is not hindsight, like I'm saying, though. This is just based on we have information now. people always get mad, like in sports, like, well, you said, well, yeah, then things changed, right? I mean, it's like you had an opinion, and then like a year later, we watched the season, or like 3 weeks later, we watched things play out.
Sure.
So like,
It doesn't make the prediction not wrong anymore, though.
well, yeah, but it's like, well, Howie Roseman thought Jalen Reagor was going to be a really good player. Then a couple years later, he realized he wasn't, and he pivoted and he got rid of him. Like, don't good GMs like, we love this guy, and then a couple years later, we realized we were right. Like it's no different than having, like, you do the same on draft picks. Like, how many guys did Mel Kiper or whoever, any fan, if you just watch a team, like, I love this guy, I thought he'd be a really good player, and for whatever reason, and if you don't not around the team every day, you don't know specifically why. Like, why isn't Zach Moss became a good player? There's got to be some sort of reason. I bet if you ask Sean McDermott, if you ask Brian Daboll, and you ask Ken Dorsey, they could describe it pretty well. Well, he lacks these two things that are a killer. That we love the guy, great guy, tries. He just, he's just I don't know, whatever the specific thing is, but you don't know that on draft times, right? We thought we could improve his accuracy. We thought he'd be faster. We thought whatever. It's part of the draft. It's part of why all these picks, and that's why, besides Jalen Waddle, what does Bradley Chubb and Tyreek Hill have in common? They went baseball style. They just traded prospects for fucking real things. Right?
Yeah, not even prospects, right? Like complete unknowns. We don't even know who it is.
Wouldn't you say a first-round pick is the equivalent of like sweet prospects in the NFL?
Yeah, but what's interesting, they did the trade November 1, right? Like, they don't even know exactly where the pick's going to be.
Who?
Well, the team that receives the pick or the team that trades the pick.
Yeah.
You don't know what a 2024 first rounder is, right? Like, one thing I want to continue with this before we go to Jeff Wilson, but like right now, the pick that the Niners got for Jeff Wilson, the 5th rounder they got for Jeff Wilson, it's the 3rd or 4th best pick the Niners have. They have 2 third comps. They have their 5th, and they have Miami's 5th. So, like, if they win more games than the Dolphins, the 5th round pick they just got for Jeff Wilson Jr. is the 3rd best pick they have on the books. Think about that.
They don't have any capital. They've used it all.
Well, no, right? I know. I'm just saying. So, but my point is, like you said, you traded for prospects, and to add even a little more uncertainty to it, you don't even know what that prospect is. I think the X factor.
The one thing is when you acquire, like the Broncos, for example, when they get a first round pick back for Bradley Chubb, they basically know. I mean, the Miami's not winning the Super Bowl, and hell, it's hard to see them in the Final Four. That means they'd have to beat the Chiefs or the Bills. So you go, I would say that's somewhere probably between 19 and 25. Like, you do have a pretty good idea on that.
But I'm just saying it's different than when you make the trade 2 weeks before the draft or the day of the draft.
Yeah,
and where the players are, where the slots are. I think the X factor in all of this, what's really hard to know is what does Kyle Shanahan believe about Trey Lance, and what decisions will he make based on that belief, right? About next year. The sunk cost fallacy, because you've spent money and invested money into something, you then spend more time trying to get that thing to work. I don't know. I don't know if he will try to make Trey Lance work because he really believes, or because they've invested so much. Those are two different things. But
and my point always on this, like, after a certain time, I think a lot of people's outside views of like, how would he have any clue? I think more than likely has to factor in, like, more than likely he has to be thinking that, right? There's just some unknown on this player at this point in time.
For sure.
Right? He could not, you would think he was a little crazy if you knew him well and he's like, I'm fucking confident we're going to win big with this guy next year. I think your reaction would have to be, whether you're a Niner fan, whether you're just a normal person, whether you're John Lynch, like, how can we know that?
Yeah, but I would say, like, his opinion on it, not because he's Kyle Shanahan, but just because he's the guy that's in the meeting room and around him every day, is different than my opinion on it based on watching practice and watching him playing games, right? Like, he does, to me, like, I do put a little more weight, since we've all seen so little of Trey, which is partly a reflection since he wasn't their quarterback last year, right? And Jimmy Garoppolo came back this year, which is some indication of Trey. Maybe not. Maybe they just knew we're going to run him 18 times a game, and that could get him hurt, and we need Jimmy around. But
you could argue just by his actions running him shows pretty clear that he's not comfortable with him throwing a lot.
Yeah, for sure. But I also think, young quarterback, we don't know what that would have turned into in year 2 and year 3 and year 4. I mean, yet maybe it never evolves, or maybe it does. I don't know. That's ideally it evolves.
And that's one of my points on this is like those couple years are already thrown out the window. And I wouldn't say he's starting from scratch, but he's starting 4 starts year 3. It's kind of crazy. It's not very much time.
That's the one thing that you have 100% agreement with me on. Is like, even if you think it's going to turn out well, it still needs, you still like, ideally, not to bring up Josh Allen or whatever, but it's like by year 3, you're ready to roll. Well, because you played year 1 and year 2. Right?
And I got to pick up your 5th-year option.
Well, and that, yeah. But these things it takes time to get the quarterback that can carry you. By the time he's expensive, he has to, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
there's not a soul that could go like he's a 5th-year option and extension player right now. Like that's, and you have those questions going into year 3. It's usually not a good sign. And you could argue this isn't because of poor play. It's because he hasn't played and he's coming off a major injury. So it's a problem for the Niners. Like the 49ers have a quarterback problem when they traded Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Bradley Chubb. Like that's a fact.
And Channing Tindall.
And Channing Tindall.
They didn't trade those guys though, because they took other picks.
I know,
right?
but and they wouldn't have acquired those guys. But my point is, they traded all those assets, and they still have a quarterback problem.